Bob Mueller turned in his exhaustive report on Russian election interference and attempted obstruction by President Trump on March 22nd, and everyone wanted to know what it said.
Robert Mueller has concluded his investigation.
He filed his formal report with the Justice Department, which announced this news at 5 p.m. Eastern on March 22nd.
Attorney General told the members of Congress he's committed to as much transparency as possible.
The Attorney General did not live up to that commitment, and Mueller stayed on the job for 68 more days until May 29th. Quietly on the job until he stepped out at that Justice Department lectern, breaking his silence to address the public for his only time as special counsel. That careful, methodical, and restrained approach was vintage Mueller, but it also left a gap for others to characterize his report. By the time Bob Mueller spoke, he was fighting misperceptions about his own work, fed by his own boss, who announced to the nation that Mueller didn't reach a conclusion on obstruction, implying Mueller had handed off that big, momentous call to Attorney General Barr, who was then announcing his view that Donald Trump did not obstruct justice. But the Mueller report did not end with a section for Barr to fill in the blank. It noted that Congress decides whether to accuse a president of obstruction, not the Justice Department. And Mueller was so concerned by Barr's summary, he wrote a formal letter of objection to Barr the very next day, which remains undisclosed as of this weekend, and a second letter 2 days later, noting that Barr was not accurately capturing the context, nature, and substance of the Mueller report, and objecting to the public confusion Barr created, which Barr later dismissed in the cattiest of terms.
You know, the letter's a bit snitty, and I think it was probably written by one of his staff people.
Blaming it on staff, well, that soon appeared disingenuous because we know, Barr knew, Mueller personally reached out.
Did anyone, either you or anyone on your staff, memorialize your conversation with Robert Mueller?
Yes.
Who did that?
There were notes taken of the call.
May we have those notes?
No.
Why not?
Why should you have them?
Attorney General Barr knew that Mueller objected. He avoided that when also pressed directly about it under oath.
Reports have emerged recently, General, that members of the special counsel's team are frustrated at some level with the limited information included in your March 24th letter, that it does not adequately or accurately necessarily portray the report's findings. Do you know what they're referencing with that?
No, I don't.
Well, whatever Mueller told Barr in their call and those letters would give him actually some knowledge on that. Barr knew what he was doing when he upstaged the written Mueller report with his televised press conference, also then on the day it came out.
The Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense.
Mueller made it clear in writing he was not exonerating this president. And so the big obvious question becomes, how different would things be and how different should things be if the first person America heard speak about the Mueller report was Mueller?
As set forth in the report, after that investigation, if we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
The Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense.
Kicking off our special tonight, former federal prosecutor John Flannery, special counsel for 3 separate congressional probes, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, and Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post. Good evening to each of you. We've had some time to let it set in. Eugene, what does it mean that Mueller has spoken, but spoken after so many others?
Well, it makes a difference. Mueller didn't go beyond the 4 corners of his 448-page report. But it's important that we heard him speak those words, that we heard him say in his double negative terms, I did not exonerate the president. A lot of people thought that he did. If you just watch Fox News all the time, and you read Breitbart, and you read the president's tweets and listened to him, you thought Mueller had given the president a clean bill of health. And for some people that I've heard from in the last couple of days,
so Gene,
this is a surprise.
Build on that point while I read to you what was known in public, which is what Mueller wrote. If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts the president did not commit obstruction, we would so state. We're unable to do that. This report does not conclude Trump committed a crime, but it does not exonerate him, Eugene.
Exactly. It was there in the report. It was reported at the time. It was in headlines at the time. But it didn't have the same impact that Mueller had the other day when he came out, hearing it from his mouth. That being one of the few points in the whole report that he chose to emphasize. It changed the weather in terms of how this report is understood.
Joyce, the weather also had a lot of clouds, which makes it hard to see the sun, which provides the light from the Office of Legal Counsel opinion. Classic analogy. But take a listen side by side. What we now have, what we didn't have until this week, is the way that Barr treated this to the way Mueller did when it comes to the central question that America has been discussing now for months, which is, what do you do if there's a crime committed by the president in office? Take a look.
We specifically asked him about the OLC opinion and whether or not he was taking the position that he would have found a crime but for the existence of the OLC opinion. And he made it very clear several times that that was not his position.
So that was Justice Department policy. Those were the principles under which we operated. And from them, we concluded that we would not reach a determination one way or the other about whether the president committed a crime.
Joyce, now that Mueller has spoken once and for all, what are we to take from it on that point?
So, Ari, I think that there are some very fine legal arguments being drawn by the Attorney General, technically saying that Mueller didn't go far enough down the road that the Office of Legal Counsel memo compelled his decision. But those are really differences without a distinction. It's clear from Mueller's comments, it's clear from the report itself, that the special counsel's team operated in an environment where they knew from the get-go that they could not indict a sitting president of the United States, that the people ultimately with jurisdiction to do that would be prosecutors after Trump left office or Congress through its impeachment powers. And all through this, Barr acts not as the people's lawyer, not as we expect an attorney general would with independence, but as someone who's always focused on one goal, protecting the president.
John, Mueller speaks in a certain way, as Gene Robinson just mentioned.
Right.
But when you look at this, was it clear enough to you what he was saying that Congress is the one to take it from here?
Absolutely. And he said on page 2 that he felt he could not, as a matter of the law within the Justice Department, indict. And so he was very clearly saying that the only open path is impeachment. And he specified a number of instances of obstruction. And what Gene was saying a minute ago, in my opinion...
Could he have said the word impeachment?
I think he should have said the word impeachment. But I think he was chosen, and he was chosen by the dynamic duo, if you will, Rosenstein and Barr, to get to this conclusion, knowing, I believe they knew, that Mueller would never contradict that proposition in the Justice Department, that you could not exercise the constitutional power to indict a sitting president.
John, take a look then at the sound of both of them now that we have again for the first time, Barr and Mueller, on the idea that, yes, some things go beyond the DOJ.
Absolutely.
Special Counsel Mueller did not indicate that his purpose was to leave the decision to Congress. I am told that his reaction to that was that it was my prerogative as Attorney General to make that decision.
The opinion says that the Constitution requires a process other than the criminal justice system to formally accuse a sitting president of wrongdoing.
Joyce, when you hear that, is he nicely saying, unlike Mr. Barr's claims, this is up to Congress, not Barr, but saying it elliptically?
This is something prosecutors often find themselves in the position of saying. I don't have jurisdiction to do this case. So for me as a U.S. attorney in Alabama, I would sometimes find I didn't have jurisdiction as a federal prosecutor, and I would turn a case over to colleagues in the state system who might have a statute they could use. Mueller seems to be acting very consistently, saying, I don't have jurisdiction. So I'm putting this in the hands of people who do.
But let me press you, Joyce. When he says I, he means we, the DOJ. The report never says, oh, the special counsel can't indict, but the attorney general can.
I think that that's clear. And when Mueller writes this letter and communicates to Bill Barr that he has concerns about the context, the nature, and the substance of the way that the attorney general portrays his report to the public, that's an incredibly global criticism. And I think much of it stems from that clip that you just played where Barr seems to say, no, Mueller wasn't leaving it to Congress. Mueller's intent seems to have clearly been to leave it to Congress.
And Gene, where do we go from here?
Well, there will be a lot of questions about William Barr and his role in this. I mean, in most of those clips, he parses his words very carefully. In that last one, that's just a lie. I mean, it's just he just lies and says that Mueller wasn't saying leave it to Congress when, in fact, that's clearly what Mueller was saying, and any intelligent person would understand that. Where we go from here is that Congress has a decision to make. Congress has to decide, and there are, of course, political dimensions to that, as well as legal and moral and constitutional dimensions. But it is now in the lap of Congress. Mueller has outlined what look to former prosecutors like offenses by the President of the United States. And Congress has to deal with that.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.